Aspetta! Giuseppe aspetta!
Today we're going to talk about locating bass during the wintertime. And I kind of broke down some baits to use in previous episodes. Be sure to check those out, whether it's a jig or jerk bait, and so on. But my recent outing with a few anglers, I noticed a pattern at my local fishery, specifically Lake Paris. And we just went out, I'd say, what was it? We just went out Saturday. And I went to familiar areas where I had success before, but had little to no success. And this lake's located like in the desert area where it's pretty bare. Your deepest water goes from like, I believe 50 to 60 feet. But the main cover over at Lake Paris would be rock piles, flooded timber, and artificial environments and structures such as submerged tires and etc. Now, when I broke down the lake, I went to, like I said, history spots. I went to places that I knew were going to hold bass. But like I said, I had little success in those areas. And that could be because of various reasons. Angler pressure, the bait have moved off. Maybe that specific area of the lake didn't have actively feeding fish in those areas. And maybe a huge population of the bluegill has migrated to another part of the lake. When I first got there, went to that section of the lake, checked it out. There was fish there, but they weren't actively feeding. So I chose to go fish deeper areas where I saw many suspended fish. But the thing is, again, kind of like the Eastman trip, I found that most suspending fish were not the species that, we're all aiming for, is largemouth bass or spotted bass or smallmouth. It turns out most of the fish were copper-nosed bluegill that were suspending out in the middle. I got one bite that could have been a copper-nosed or a bass that was grouped up in, I think, a school of just two fish. I was fishing like 20 feet of water, and I was drifting in the wind. And I noticed these two marks out in 20 feet of water, and I casted my jerk bait. I jerked, got their attention, got one of the fish's attention, and I jerked, and that fish kept on following me, and I drifted maybe 10, 15 yards, and finally the fish committed, but came off. Which led me to think maybe it was a copper nose because because those copper nose will strike at the bait, but obviously you won't get a good hookup ratio because their mouths are so small. And a copper nose is sort of like it's a huge panfish, basically. And at that point, I was struggling the whole entire day. I was getting short striked by copper-nosed bluegills that were suspending anywhere from 15 to 22 feet of water. And it really hit the ego really hard because here I am explaining to you guys my experiences and my knowledge about bass fishing, but I could not get bit. So the next thing I did was check out the artificial structures. I went over to the tires, and the tires were, I believe they were 20 to 30 feet. I'd say 20 to 30, 38 feet. And again, there were schools of massive copper-nosed bluegills, just like massive schools. And I don't know what it is. This lake is, I think it's being taken over by bluegill. So if you're a copper-nose or panfish fisherman, go out there and start catching those bluegills and copper-nose, just because it's getting out of hand over there. So with little to no success there, my buddy Joel was able to catch a few on a drop shot. And wherever you're gonna find forage for bass, copper-nose bluegills, you're gonna find bass around the areas around, off the structure a little bit of those copper-nose, maybe in mud, where it's a little bit warmer. But at that point, I was about to give up, and so there was a tree line, a little bit shallower, a lot shallower than those submerged the submerged tires. So around 8 to 14 feet, I decided, I'm going to slow down. I'm going to dissect the area, right? So, and I would automatically think you need to go deep for these largemouth bass, because in the wintertime, they like ditches, they like muds, they like muddy areas, and etc. But I was wrong. I scanned the trees, and I'm using my live scope, and I'm looking at the lanes where you can actually cast in without getting snagged with a jerkbait. And lo and behold, there's just massive schools of fish that are comfortably suspending between all the flooded brush and the flooded trees. And it was heavily populated. So what led me to think, bass go deep during the winter? They do. But when you're given an environment where it's overcast and it's wintertime, and you have a great environment like flooded timber, the bass are gonna be there. They're gonna be residential bass that live there. So make sure you don't, make sure you put flooded timber and flooded brush on a list to cover when you're out in the water during wintertime, because whether if it's 7-8 feet of water all the way up to 30-40 feet of water, there's gonna be residential bass there that you need to check to see if they're actively feeding. So I slowed down, pointed my live scope. I was working my way. I'm working east. And when I was working up east, I was pointing my live scope to the left. And I was just scanning for areas for suspended bass in areas that there were lanes. So I could successfully cast my jerkbait between two brush piles or two flooded timber areas. And I could successfully, make a 70, 80 foot cast and work it back to the kayak. So my first fish was an 11-incher, non-keeper, but it boosted my confidence a lot, because if there's an 11-incher in, I'd say 100 yards of flooded timber, there's gonna be your 16, 17, 18, 20-inch largemouth bass hanging around that structure. So continue to work my way up, and then I started noticing more fish. So I hit my kayak on spot lock, pointed my transducer back at a lane between two brush piles, and it was almost like at an angle like this behind me. So I spot locked, I cast it right to my left, maybe let's say this is 12 o'clock right here, so I casted me 7 o'clock or 6 o'clock. I cast it right between two brush piles, and you can notice the tips of them above the water. So they're not completely submerged. The lake kind of give you tips on, where the brush piles are by revealing at least the tops of them. So I cast it in that lane right there, and I reeled down a little bit, and I twitched, real twitch, and then I started noticing followers. And when you're getting followers, you could almost bet that you're gonna get bit. Higher odds that you're gonna get bit at least. So as I was twitching it back to the kayak, I noticed a few following, and I started twitching it even faster. Bam, twitch. Bam, reel, bam, reel, bam, reel. Sometimes I use the drag star to flick, to gain up on the line as soon as I jerk. And so I'll jerk, even faster, even violently. And I didn't allow the fish to see the bait, but to kind of react to all the jerks, all the kind of slashes that jerkbait would make. Finally, I hook up. My line is wrapped up on the tip, but I slowly shake that line off to kind of unravel the wrap. And I reel it in, and I toss it in the boat. And it ends up being 17 and a half inches. I believe it was like a 3.25 pound bass. And bam, boosted my confidence. And I want to let you guys learn off of my experiences, because, that myth of bass go deep during the wintertime and you can only find them deep. That myth is totally busted. It's there will be residential bass up shallow during the winter too. You just gotta find the ones that want to eat, and you gotta find the bait fish, and you gotta find where they are actively chowing down on bait, where they're most comfortable around the lake. So if you're in a lake that has flooded timber or flooded tires, you need to check those areas. Even if they're shallower than you assume the bass will be. So, this lake is as deep as 50, 60 feet. But if you notice there's flooded timber and flooded brush piles, bass love those areas, especially during the wintertime. And, if you're in a lake where there's so many brush piles, so much flooded timber, what I like to do is check out your spawning areas. And then right out of your spawning areas, if you have flooded timber, check those areas out too. It also helps that if you have knowledge and experiences on that water already and know where those spawning flats are, then you can assume that, hey, let's go travel the spawning areas, work our way out to that flooded timber and brush piles, and see if they're just staging up on there during the wintertime, constantly eating, whether if it's copper nose, baby carp, or even shad. But that's my greatest tip for this week is, you don't always gotta assume that the largemouth bass are gonna be deep in the mud. It's a great place to start, but if you do have a lake around you with flooded timber, you can't rule it out. You just can't, and especially if it's in like 14, 15, 7 feet, 8 feet of water, you still gotta check, because I tell you what, if I didn't check, I would have definitely skunked that day. Some things that you may consider to throw in these brush areas, what I noticed, most of my largemouth bass were suspended anywhere from 4 to 6 feet of water. I had most of my success throwing a 110 junior, plus one. But what I did notice, like I said, is those bass are spending a lot higher, higher than my jerkbait depth, so my jerkbait was almost in line with them. You know, things that you can use would be like a soft jerkbait, a very tiny soft jerkbait, so that way it has the right kind of sinking rate for them to kind of react to that bait. You almost want to stay like almost 90%, 99% of the time you want to stay above their heads. So I think a soft jerkbait would have worked either in a bluegill pattern or shad pattern. Obviously a jerkbait would work. I didn't have any regular 110 juniors, but I assume that would work for your little bit deeper fish. Let's say that's sitting in 8 feet of water to 9 feet of water. You might want to try your +1s. I did notice I got snagged on a lot of brush piles using the +1, but at the same time I had a little bit of success with the +1, so I decided to throw it primarily the whole entire time that I found that pattern. Another bait you could probably choose is a drop shot with a higher leader. A lot of those fish that are spending high up in the water column, in like 7-8 feet of water, they'll go down for a drop shot. Let me see, what else can you throw? I believe an 1/8 ounce or a 1/16 of an ounce with a 2.8 Kitech in bluegill pattern would also work. But then again, you know, I was still getting bit by coppernose. So if you want to mix in the fun between bass and coppernose panfish, feel free to throw your 1/8 ounce jig heads, small little hook, maybe like a size 1 or 1/0, with a 2.8 Kitech and bluegill. But other than that, that's my probably biggest recommendations in terms of bait. You could also throw an A-rig, but I would throw like a mini A-rig that has the lightest heads possible. I know my buddies tried the flutter spoon, but I would be kind of hesitant throwing a flutter spoon in brush. You could probably throw it in the lanes, but you're only working with 7 to 12 feet of water, 7 to 14 feet of water, so you got to be careful with that. Now, if the bass were not as suspending as high in the water column, from what I gained in knowledge, they were pretty high, and for that reason, I wasn't throwing the square bill and any crankbaits that much, but you could dabble around with that. I only threw it a few times, and I didn't have a really strong indication that I should be throwing it more often since I was getting bit on the jerkbait. But you could be throwing a square bill, Strike King, especially if those bass decide not to suspend that high in the water column. Like I said, there were 4 feet of water. If they were suspending, 6, 7 feet of water, and let's say, right off the bottom in 8 feet, or 2 feet off the bottom and 10 feet, or 3 feet off the bottom and 8 feet of water, or 9 feet of water, and then maybe you want to throw a jerkbait. So since they'll be looking up, and the square bill will be deflecting off all the brush piles and etc. You can also try that. But yeah, I would try square bill, jerkbait, soft jerkbait, drop shot. And if you're very ambitious during this time, you can even throw a glide bait. And I would choose something that's light enough that won't sink very fast. Maybe you could throw a Clash. I don't have that much experience with the big old swim baits, but something that's not going to sink very fast. So a slow sinking glide bait that you could tune with lead wire making sure that bait, when you give it its twitches, it won't rise out of 3 feet and it won't sink below the fish in 4 feet. So anywhere from that, I'd say 1 to 3 feet of water is that's the water column that you want to stick with, especially in that flooded timber area. But other than that, maybe a soft swim bait, mag draft, maybe something light that you could slow roll on the top of their heads, and then just kind of speed up crank on it, and then slow roll speed. Just mix it up, get those bass, kind of triggered. But yeah, so the biggest tip that I gotta give you is make sure you go shallow if you had flooded brush, or shallower, especially if you have flooded brush. If you don't have flooded brush piles, you might have to go offshore and look for artificial, rock piles or artificial tires that were kind of placed there for bass environments. For instance, Eastman, there's not much out there. There are rock piles out there, but I think the largemouth out there are going to be in your mud areas and whatever kind of flooded timber you got out there, they're going to be staged up near those areas as well. But if you like what I had to say, I did a lot of jibber jabbering on this video. But if you like what you heard, tune into the next episode, subscribe, and comment below your favorite way of fishing during the wintertime. Peace.